Have you ever imagined what it's like to be betrayed by the man you trusted most, and then have to watch him walk down the aisle, Bible in hand, as if nothing had happened? My name is Linda Thompson. I'm 60 years old, and I've been a Christian since I was 18. What I'm about to tell you now isn't part of the traditional church testimonies. It's not that cute story of overcoming obstacles that ends with an immediate happy ending. It's real, it's painful, it's full of silence, judgment, and betrayal, all within the context of faith. But it's also a story of restoration, healing, and a faith that, even though shaken, hasn't been destroyed. I was married to a preacher, a man who, in the eyes of the congregation, was an exemplary servant of God, but at home he hid an abyss. When I discovered his betrayal, the ground beneath my feet disappeared. But the hardest part wasn't facing the truth. It was being told to shut up, being advised to protect his ministry while my soul bled in. Silence. How many women do you know who have been through this? Or rather, have you ever been through something like this? Being betrayed emotionally, spiritually, and still accused of being the problem? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. Not just about me, but about what happens to many Christian women when pain invades even the most sacred place in their lives, the altar. This isn't a story about resentment. It's about a choice, to remain silent or to speak out. And I chose to speak out, because someone needs to break this cycle of guilt, shame, and abandonment. I was called crazy. They said I would destroy his reputation, but no one cared about what the betrayal destroyed inside me. And it was then, exactly then, that something started to change. When I met Mark, I truly believed he was a direct answer to my prayers. You know that feeling of, this is him? It was like that. He was kind, always smiling, and knew exactly what to say. He had a presence, a calm voice that seemed to carry wisdom. And above all, he preached with such passion that it was impossible not to be moved. People looked at him as if he were sent from God, and I confess, did too. Our relationship lasted only a few months. Everything happened so quickly. He said he knew what he wanted, that he saw no reason to wait, and deep down, I felt chosen. I was 26, full of dreams, carrying old wounds I'd never had the courage to face. When he proposed, there, kneeling with the Bible open, I cried. I thought I'd found that happy ending they always told me would come to those who waited on God. The wedding was simple but beautiful. The church was packed. People were crying, lots of prayer, and promises. So many promises. Promises of fidelity, of respect, of a life together before the Lord. For a while it seemed like everything was truly going as it had in the testimonial books I'd read. He preached, I took care of the house, supported the ministry, helped with visits. I was that virtuous woman everyone praised. But behind the scenes, something was already off, and I didn't want to see it. There are hidden truths that only time reveals, and the first of these was haste. That haste that seemed like passion, but hid the urgency of a man who didn't know how to handle real intimacy, with emotional depth. He loved me, yes, but in a shallow, convenient way. And I, in the name of faith, became a woman increasingly molded to his expectations, forgetting my own identity. Little by little, the silences crept in, the absences justified by ministry commitments, the quick messages, the poorly crafted excuses. But still, I defended him, because he was the man of God, and I was the helper. And when we're within a rigid religious structure, where everything revolves around image and reputation, we learn to swallow the discomfort and call it submission. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what began as a Christian fairy tale turned into a journey of loss of identity, emotional silence, and decisions that completely changed the course of my life. I gave myself body, soul, and spirit to his mission. While Mark prepared to preach, I was there, behind the scenes of faith, getting everything organized, setting the coffee table, washing my eyes on the pillow, and drying them before anyone noticed. The service was barely over, and I was already caring for those who needed prayer, serving the brothers, sorting out the details no one saw, but which made the whole machine work. I was the preacher's wife, and that for me was more than a title. It was an identity. Before preaching, I would lay hands on him and pray with faith. I interceded. I fasted. I sought revelation. It was as if my role was to keep the fire burning on his altar, even as my own was dying. And for a time, I thought that was love, that serving was loving, that silence was obeying. But the truth is, there was a silent imbalance, growing between us, a spiritual weight that wasn't shared, only borne. At church events, people praised me. They said I was a blessing, that he was lucky. But inside, I was starting to feel invisible. He received the applause, the honors, the invitations, and I received the responsibilities. I was the one who comforted him when he was frustrated. I was the one who listened to the criticism he couldn't hear. I absorbed it all to protect him, believing it was part of our calling together. But it wasn't. Over time, I realized my life was revolving around his. My desires were fading, my dreams shelved. Decisions always came from the same direction, from the pulpit to the home. And even though he called me a wise woman, often what he wanted was silence, not wisdom. I began to live for image. Ours, his, the perfect marriage, the growing ministry. And behind it all, a hidden truth began to scream. I was disappearing into the role I'd agreed to play. But this kind of surrender, when not reciprocated, becomes a prison disguised as a purpose. And the impact goes far beyond routine. It affects identity, self-esteem, and clarity. You begin to doubt your own perception, your own voice. And how can you talk about spiritual fatigue when everyone sees you as the fortress of faith? It was in this silence, in this seemingly noble role of pastor's wife, that I began to see the first signs of a betrayal that was already underway, and that would change everything I thought I knew about love, faith, and loyalty. There was a time when Mark began to change, and I sensed it even before I could name him. He still spoke about God with the same eloquence, still preached with that conviction that moved people. But inside the house, his voice began to fade. His eyes no longer met mine as before. When I tried to talk, he said he was tired, too overwhelmed with ministry, and wanting to be understanding. I accepted it. I attributed it to his demanding schedule, his spiritual demands, the commitments he carried, as if he were solely responsible for the world's salvation. But it was more than fatigue. It was distancing, first emotional, then physical. Hugs became formal. Prayers together became rare. Even meals began to happen at different times, because he was taking care of church matters or needed time alone with God. And I, stuck in the idea that a Christian wife's role is to endure in silence, continued serving, waiting, believing it was just a phase. The problem is that deep down, I already knew something was wrong. But our mindset sometimes chooses to deny what our hearts already cry out for, out of fear, out of shame, out of not wanting to destroy an image that took so much to build. I remember one particular night when he came home smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. A silly detail, but it hit me like a thunderbolt. When I asked, he laughed. He said he'd hugged a sister on his way out of the service, and I wanted to believe him. I really wanted to. Because facing the possibility of betrayal at that point in my journey meant dismantling the entire landscape I'd helped to sustain. It wasn't just about the marriage, it was about everything I represented inside. The pastor's wife betrayed? What kind of impact would that have on the church? On the leaders? On the people who admired us? The hidden truth is that often we don't ignore the signs out of naivety. We ignore them because we're not ready to deal with the consequences of seeing them. And I was afraid of loneliness, of judgment, of discovering that perhaps it had all been more appearance than truth. But the signs were there. His cell phone always on silent, the forced smile when he saw me, the lost glances, as if he were somewhere else, even though he was right next to me. And worst of all, the emotional absence had already become a habit, and I was getting used to living without being noticed. I began to notice small lies in my daily life, schedule mismatches, commitments that didn't align with the church calendar, vague excuses. But every time I questioned him, He skillfully turned the tables. He made me feel guilty for distrusting him. He told me I was being influenced by the enemy, that my mind was being attacked by thoughts that didn't come from God. And I believed him. Because when someone dominates the narrative with spiritual authority, it's easy to distort even the most obvious truth. I was led to believe that doubt was a sin, that my discomfort was a lack of faith. These subtle, silent games are more dangerous than a direct confession, because they erode sanity, confuse feelings, and distort the perception of reality. You begin to live between faith and suspicion, between loyalty and fear. And the cruelest thing is that, in this scenario, spirituality becomes a weapon. The Word of God, which should be comfort, becomes an argument to silence, to invalidate pain, because it was precisely at that point, on this shaky ground, between doubt and faith, that I began to put the pieces together and face what, until then, I hadn't wanted to see, the truth about who he was becoming. It was a Sunday afternoon, after the morning service. I was in the church kitchen, organizing the communion cups, when I heard someone calling me softly. It was Carol, one of the most discreet sisters in the congregation, the kind who hardly speaks, but when they do, we listen. She pulled me aside, nervous, her eyes brimming with tears. She said, "Forgive me, Sister Linda, but I couldn't stay quiet any longer. You deserve to know." I felt my stomach churn before I even knew what it was. And then she flipped open her phone. The messages were there, right before my eyes. Sweet, intimate words, nothing to do with pastoral advice or spiritual matters. They were hidden affection, touches disguised as emojis, plans made in the silence of my own home. And her name? She was someone I knew, someone who frequented our house, sat at our table, prayed hand in hand with me. A woman from the church, not a stranger, not a woman of the world, as many would say. She was one of us. This hurt in a place I didn't even know existed. In that moment, everything made sense. The coldness, the excuses, the schedule changes. It wasn't about the ministry. It was about betrayal. A betrayal that wasn't just marital. It was spiritual, emotional, communal. It was as if the ground had been ripped from under my feet inside the temple I helped keep. Standing. Carol was trembling, but she held her phone tightly in front of me. She said she'd hesitated for months to tell me, afraid of being seen as a gossip, of displeasing the pastor. And that shocked me even more, because if a woman is afraid to tell the truth to protect her spiritual abuser, there's something deeply wrong with the structure we've normalized. I drove home in silence. Each mile felt like tearing a veil. The images that once seemed like scenes from a blessed marriage were now blurred with doubts, with fragments of everything I'd ignored. I wondered how I hadn't seen it. As a woman of faith, prayer, and fasting, I hadn't seen it. But the hidden truth is that even sharp spirituality can't always see what the heart refuses to admit. Because it's not about a lack of judgment. It's about the emotional toll of being in a relationship where lies are skillfully disguised with words of authority. I got home, closed the door, and sat on the living room floor. I didn't cry. Right away, I stood there, staring into space, feeling a deafening silence. I needed to decide what to do with that revelation. Tell her? Confront her? Pretend it never happened? It was a maze, and inside me, something began to break. A part I'd sustained for years with faith, prayer, and a love that I now realized had been one-sided. My mind began to race, trying to reassemble every scene, every gesture, every absence, and reevaluate everything through the lens of truth. And that's something no one tells you, how much the truth has the power to free you and crush you at the same time. I remember the prayer I said that day. I didn't ask for strength, I asked for clarity, because at that moment, I no longer wanted to remain blind. I needed to see, even if it hurt, even if it changed everything. And it did. My perspective changed. My mindset changed. Because when you discover that the person you shared your life with also shared promises with someone else, you're never the same again. And there began a new journey, not of separation, but of internal transformation. Because the hardest decision wasn't about him. It was about me, about stopping hiding behind the role of the good Christian wife and starting to face the woman who had been silenced for years. On Sunday night, when he walked up to the altar with the Bible in his hands, speaking about fidelity as if the words were pure, my entire body trembled. I was sitting in the second row, as always. The same posture, the same restrained smile, the same hands clasped in my lap, but something inside me was no longer the same, because now I knew, and knowing changes everything. It changes the sound of the voice that once gave you security. It changes the look you avoided out of respect and now avoid out of disgust. It even changes the weight of silence. Only no one could see. I was there, surrounded by brothers and sisters who admired his every sentence, while inside me the pain spread like a slow poison. He spoke about covenant, about being loyal, upright, faithful in thought and deed, and with each word, it was like a knife cutting deeper. Because I knew the other side of that speech. I knew the messages, the absences, the fabricated excuses. I had seen with my own eyes the hidden truth behind the impeccable posture. And yet, I stood there, silent, as if nothing had happened. Because at that moment, more than pain, I felt paralysis. It wasn't fear of him. It was fear of myself, fear of the explosion that would occur if I broke that theater. Because it wasn't just my marriage that would crumble. It was the image of the exemplary pastor, the status, the leadership, the respect of the community. It was in that service that I discovered the weight of carrying a truth you can't say out loud. Because when the traitor dons the garment of the anointed, whoever dares to denounce him becomes a scandal. I knew this. I had seen other women discredited, accused of bitterness, of unforgiveness, of being instruments of the enemy simply for pointing out the faults of those who occupied the pulpit. So I kept quiet, but I cried. I didn't cry out loud. I didn't make a scene. I just let the tears flow, discreetly, from the corners of my eyes. Those tears said everything I couldn't shout. I know. And the pain of knowing without being able to speak is an emotional prison difficult to explain. I wondered how he could stand there and speak with such confidence. Was he so self-deceived? Or had the practice of deception become second nature? It was impossible not to think of how many other people were living similar lies within their own homes, but using faith as a shield to keep up appearances. This was the most profound impact, realizing how religiosity can be used as a cover to hide weaknesses that have never been addressed, only glossed over. There, sitting on that bench, I felt like I was alone in a crowded room. There were people everywhere, but no one was really with me, because no one knew. And even if they did, would they believe me? Or was his mask so well constructed that I would be seen as unbalanced? I didn't want trouble. I didn't want to destroy anyone, but I also couldn't bear the weight of that omission any longer. It was an internal war between the desire for justice and the fear of the consequences. That night, when the service ended, he came down from the altar and came to me as if nothing had happened. He touched my shoulder, smiled, and asked, "Shall we go, love?" I nodded in response. On the outside, the same submissive wife. On the inside, a wounded woman, suffocated by a system that teaches us to endure in silence. When we got in the car, the silence was deathly. I stared out the window as he talked about the sermon, and I just thought, how many others live this and have nowhere to run? It's cruel to realize that, in some environments, image is worth more than the truth, and silence becomes the only way to avoid being attacked. But even there, amidst the chaos, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't anger. It was awareness. I was no longer the woman who lived to keep everything intact. I was awakening, albeit slowly, to a new mindset, a more realistic view of faith, marriage, my own identity. And as much as the pain was present, it was pushing me out of the cave, forcing me to see that if I didn't make decisions for myself, no one would. And that's when the first seeds of transformation began to sprout. Still subtle, still fragile, but alive. Because after so long trying to be the perfect wife, I was finally beginning to remember who the woman behind it all was. And it was in that silent moment that I realized my pain needed to find a way to express itself, even if it was whispered amidst so much spiritual clamor. I knew I wasn't alone. I knew that somewhere other women were going through similar storms, trying to keep their faith afloat while their homes silently crumbled. So, if this topic resonates with you, if in some way this story touches deep feelings within you, perhaps similar to yours, then like this video. Seriously, because every like helps this message reach more people who need to hear what perhaps no one has ever had the courage to say. And more than numbers, this is about creating space for honest conversations. It's about showing that there is a place where difficult truths can also be welcomed, without judgment, without masks, just with the courage to exist. It took me a long time to understand this myself. The feeling of being alone, trapped in a role that everyone applauds, but that suffocates inside, is an invisible prison. When everything crumbles inside, and the outside world continues to wait for its smiling face, loneliness becomes a silent scream. And in that scream, I began to realize how much my emotions had been pushed under the rug of religiosity. For years, I thought that enduring was a sign of spiritual strength, that silence was maturity, that enduring in the name of witnessing was faith. But all of this, I now understand, was fear disguised as virtue. There, amidst the inner chaos, I began to remember the woman I was before I erased myself to fit the mold of the ideal wife. I no longer wanted to survive hiding from myself, because there comes a time when the pain of staying the way I am begins to outweigh the fear of change. And that was the breaking point, the invisible line that separates submission from erasure. I needed to make decisions. I needed to look truth in the eye, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. And it was like that, in that dark place of my soul, that a new flame began to ignite. And I confess, this part was one of the most painful, because when I finally mustered the courage to ask for help, it wasn't just to expose a betrayal, it was to try to save what was left of me. But the response I received from the leadership was like a punch to the chest. "Be wise, sister. Don't destroy his ministry." That echoed in my mind like a verdict, as if my pain were an institutional risk, as if a woman's suffering were worth less than the reputation of a pulpit. It was at that moment that I realized the weight of the imposed silence and how much it's disguised as spirituality. It wasn't just about protecting his image, it was about keeping the structures running as if nothing had happened. And me? I became the threat, the unstable one, the emotional one, the one who couldn't mix personal life with God's work, as if it were possible to separate the spiritual from the human when our hearts are bleeding inside the church. And you know what's even more cruel? Inside, I still felt guilty, because these words weren't coming from distant, cold, or unrelated people. They were leaders I admired, people who had prayed with me, fasted with me, who called me the Lord's precious vessel. But all it took was me showing the cracks for them to become flaws, as if being betrayed made me less worthy of care, as if exposing the truth were a lack of spiritual maturity. This perverse logic made me understand that silence there was more than a choice. It was a demand disguised as advice, an invisible obedience, a kind of manipulation that binds through guilt and disguises itself as God's direction. And for fear of being called a rebel, a ministry destroyer, I remained silent. But silence didn't drown out the noise within me. Quite the opposite. With each service, with each new sermon on fidelity, on Christian homes, on honor, my body screamed, but only I heard. And it was at this point in my journey that I began to realize something even more profound. How much the system often protects the structure, not the people. How many other women like me have been erased behind the scenes while the spotlight remained on the altar. It's a collective wound, but one that each woman carries alone, in the dark, afraid of being labeled unbalanced, of causing scandal, of shaming the gospel. But how can you shame a gospel that has always been about truth, justice, and compassion? Why has speaking what's real become synonymous with rebellion? These questions began to stir within me. I no longer wanted to participate in a system that only welcomes you while you're smiling, that only calls you a blessing when you don't bother anyone, that only recognizes you when you follow the script. I wanted fresh air. I wanted to reclaim the truth of what it means to be a child of God, whole, human, imperfect, but true. And it was in this conflict, on this fragile terrain between faith and disappointment, that something began to move within me. That's when the pain began to change shape. It wasn't just about the betrayal, nor the silence from the leadership. It was about the sidelong glances in the hallways, the conversations interrupted when I arrived, the fake smiles that carried hidden judgment. Suddenly, I went from being the pastor's wife to being the one who couldn't hold the marriage together. People didn't ask how I was doing. They wanted to know what I'd done. Because, for many there, him continuing to preach was proof enough that the problem wasn't with him. If he had the microphone, then he was still anointed. And me? I became just an uncomfortable reminder of something everyone preferred to ignore. They said I wasn't wise, that I didn't cover him in prayer, that I was probably leaving him needy, that maybe I wasn't as submissive as I seemed. Each insinuation was a thorn in a still bleeding wound. The narrative turned against me, and worse, in the name of spirituality, as if it were easier to spiritualize the woman's guilt than to confront the truth of a man who used the altar as a shield. And then comes that bitter question that begins to haunt the heart. Am I the one in the wrong? Is everything I'm feeling an exaggeration? Because when everyone around you paints you as the root of the problem, there comes a time when your own mind begins to agree with the lie. But behind this collective judgment, there was fear. Fear of looking at the truth and realizing that it may be closer than one imagines. Because if a leader betrays, remains silent, and continues to be applauded, what does that reveal about the structure that sustains him? It's more convenient to point the finger at those who stayed than to confront the character of those still in the pulpit. And this is the kind of hidden truth that many people don't want to touch, because it requires decision, repositioning, and courage. And not everyone is willing to give up the comfort of blindness. I began to understand that my suffering wasn't just mine. It was a reflection of a culture where forgiveness is demanded of women, but repentance from men is presumed without any proof. Where the impact of pain is measured based on who holds the most power, not who was hurt the most. And that changes everything. Because the wound ceases to be emotional and becomes spiritual. You begin to doubt your own faith, your own dignity, your own worth before God. But even in this dark place, something inside me refused to die. There was a seed of lucidity, insistent, small, but alive. And it reminded me that no, I was not the mistake. That my story, however distorted it might be in the eyes of others, still carried a truth that no one could erase. And that there is a kind of freedom that begins precisely when you stop trying to prove what you feel and start truly listening to yourself. It was then that, amidst the external judgment, I began an internal journey of reconciliation with myself. And this journey, though silent, would be the most decisive of all. 1 month, 30 days, 4 weeks. It seems like a short time on the calendar, but when grief invades every second, that interval stretches like a crooked eternity. He left home on an ordinary afternoon. There was no goodbye, no explanation. Just a packed suitcase, a cold silence, and a door closing like a period I hadn't written. I stood there, in the middle of the living room, with my daughter's voices in the background and a deafening echo inside me. What now? He didn't look back. He didn't ask if we had anything to eat, if I was okay, if the girls needed anything. He just left. And days later, there he was at the podium. Impeccable tie, firm voice, hands raised. Speaking about restoration, family, principles. Impeccable theater for an audience that applauded without knowing or pretending not to know what was happening behind the scenes. And that was perhaps the cruelest blow. Watching his life go on as if my daughters and I were a convenient mistake to be erased from the narrative. I didn't have the luxury of stopping. I didn't have time to grieve. The bills kept coming, the girls' school commitments piled up, and loneliness became routine. Friends disappeared. Some vanished out of fear of getting involved, others out of convenience. And there were still those who chose to believe I deserved this abandonment, because It's easier to justify absence with a woman's supposed flaws than to face the uncomfortable truth about the man everyone called a servant of God. I was cast aside spiritually, emotionally, socially, as if my existence had lost its right to be noticed. I found myself questioning everything: my faith, my worth, my choices. The Bible that once embraced me became a battlefield within me. Every verse I read was a confrontation with promises that seemed distant. Every prayer I offered was a muffled scream trying to pierce the ceiling. I prayed but felt nothing. I cried out but saw no answers. And yet, some part of me insisted on continuing. Because within the chaos, there is a strength we don't know we have until it's the only thing left. During this time, I learned that absence also teaches. When everything falls apart and no one comes to rescue you, you're forced to find refuge within yourself. And this isn't pretty or poetic. It's lonely, confusing, exhausting, but it's real. And this reality made me realize that perhaps, for the first time, I was facing my rawest truth. I was alone, but alive, painfully alive. And this, as contradictory as it may seem, was the beginning of something. A kind of forced birth, where everything I believed about protection, faith, and love was being deconstructed. There were days when I wondered if he thought about his daughters, if he remembered their birthdays, their fevers in the early morning, their prayers before bed. But his absence hurt not. Only because of the physical absence. It screamed at the unfulfilled promises, the broken vows, the lack of commitment to what he himself claimed to be his mission. Seeing someone publicly live a role that completely contradicted the private impact of their decisions was a kind of silent but constant violence. And I had to learn to survive in the midst of it. There was no longer an audience, no applause, no praise disguised as spirituality. Just me, two confused children, and a faith in tatters. But it was on this ground that I began to see something that had previously been obscured by many layers of religiosity and fear. There were days when the only prayer I could muster was a suffocated silence, suffocated by tears on my pillow. There were no more beautiful words, no ready-made hope, just a lump in my throat and a heart too tired to pretend everything was under control. I'd look up and ask, God, why did you let this happen? And it wasn't a theological question. It was a raw cry, an unanswered outburst, because when pain reaches the soul, no amount of speech can resolve it. What remains is the chasm between what you believed and what you're experiencing. There were days when the desire to disappear was greater than the strength to carry on, not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion. I thought, if this is all faith, if this is all church, then maybe I'm in the wrong place. Because how could the same faith that taught me to trust now demand silence in the face of injustice? How could the same community that embraced me when I smiled now turn its face away from me when I most needed to be seen? I began to doubt my sanity, to wonder if I was overreacting, if perhaps deep down I truly harbored some kind of hidden guilt. And this thought is cruel, because it undermines your identity while disguising the real problem. I'd sit in the back pew of the church and couldn't sing anymore. The words would get stuck. The praises seemed to echo in a bubble that no longer included me. I'd see people raising their hands, dancing, celebrating, and inside me there was only noise, a profound disconnect, as if I were present in body but exiled in soul. And yet, I'd return, week after week, not because I wanted to, but because some wounded part of me insisted on not letting go of the last cord that bound me to faith. It was like walking in the dark blindfolded, guided only by an ancient memory of what once sustained me. I thought about giving up on everything: church, ministry, purpose, even faith. I thought about disappearing, changing cities, names, stories. But at the same time, there was another voice, very soft, deep down, that said, "It doesn't end here." And it was this voice, weak and almost imperceptible, that kept me from closing the doors for good. I no longer wanted to hear promises. I no longer wanted to be comforted by ready-made phrases. What I wanted was understanding. I wanted to find meaning amidst the chaos. And more than that, I wanted to find myself again, Because this was no longer just a crisis of faith, it was a crisis of identity. It was in this scenario, with everything in ruins, that I began to realize something that had previously eluded me. Perhaps the faith that was crumbling wasn't true. Perhaps what I was losing was a system, a structure, but not God. Because God, despite all the silence, was still there. He didn't shout, didn't appear with thunder or immediate answers, but he remained. And this began to transform me, little by little, without fanfare, without spectacle, a slow reconstruction, which first required destroying everything that was an illusion. And it was precisely in this process of reconstruction that my true journey began to take shape. It was in the silence of my room, where no one applauded, where there were no lights or memorized words, that the reconstruction truly began. There, with my soul in tatters and without any emotional makeup, God didn't appear as I imagined. He didn't come to solve everything at once, nor did he immediately free me from the pain. But he did come, and that was the beginning of it all. There were no chants, no leaders imposing what I should feel. There was just me, my wreckage, and a gentle presence that, little by little, taught me to breathe again. In that involuntary solitude, where I was forced to confront everything I believed, I began to see things differently. What I had previously seen as defeat began to take on the appearance of liberation. That structure that had crumbled upon me was not a castle of faith. It was an emotional prison disguised as holiness. And for the first time, I realized how much my faith was conditioned by the validation of others. I had been taught to fear the church's judgment more than to trust in God's love. This was one of the greatest revelations of my journey. I didn't need to deserve love. I didn't need to perform perfectly. I was loved, simply for existing. It was there, far from the performance, that I encountered a God who didn't shout, but whispered to my spirit that I still had value, even when I doubted everything, even when I felt unworthy. This experience completely changed my mindset. The pain didn't cease to exist, but it lost its power to define me. I began to understand that the healing process isn't linear. Sometimes it feels like a regression. Other times, it feels like nothing is happening. But every tear that flows without an audience is a crack being mended. Within, and along the way, I realized that true faith isn't built on the stage. It's built behind the scenes of the soul, on the days when no one sees, when you have to choose between continuing even though you feel nothing or abandoning everything because you're exhausted. And this choice, made in silence, has a profound impact. It's there that true transformation begins. It's not about returning to who you were before the pain. It's about becoming someone who could only exist after it. A more awakened, more real, more self-aware version. And above all, freer. Because when pain digs deep, it opens space for a reconstruction that goes far beyond religion. It goes beyond the walls of the temple, beyond rituals. It's a faith embodied in real life, a spirituality that makes you look inward with compassion, that teaches you to love yourself without needing to ask permission. And when this begins to happen, something powerful shifts. You stop looking for salvation outside and begin to recognize the divine presence within. The journey isn't easy, but it is profoundly transformative. And it was there, in that bare place of the soul, that I began to realize that what had been broken wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something much truer. When I started listening to other women, something inside me shifted. At first, they were timid conversations, broken outbursts, as if shame still insisted on being present in every word. But as their stories intertwined with my own, I began to realize a truth no one had the courage to say out loud. There was a multitude of women broken in silence, trying to survive the wreckage left by stories similar to mine. Betrayal, abandonment, veiled humiliation, and faith used as a shackle. The pain had different accents, but the essence was the same. These voices didn't come from the pulpit. They came from behind the scenes, from the dark corners where no one preaches, where there's no microphone or space at conferences. But they came with a power that only those who know the taste of loss can carry. And listening to these women, I understood something that books, cults, and counseling had never taught me. There was a kind of healing that only flourished in the realm of empathy. I no longer needed to explain myself. He didn't need to prove he was a saintly victim, or that he'd tried hard enough. It was enough to exist, whole or in pieces. They understood. It was in this honest, unfiltered space that a new awareness blossomed. The pain that had previously isolated me began to connect me, and this connection was revolutionary. Because when a woman who has been silenced meets another who has also survived forced silence, something ignites. It's as if a new language is born, a language of scars, of resistance, of reconstruction without a manual. And there, in that improvised space of listening and acceptance, I realized how much we've been taught to compare ourselves, to compete, to maintain a facade, when in reality, what we needed most was to recognize ourselves in each other. Each story showed me a hidden pattern, a cycle repeated with different names and faces, but with the same devastating impact. And most perversely, many of these women continued to blame themselves. They continued to believe they had failed as wives, as Christians, as people. I saw in each of them a reflection of the woman I had been, trying to fit within a system that molded us into silence. But together, we began to break. Through these frames, we began to name the wounds. And naming pain is an act of courage, because where there is a name, there is also the possibility of liberation. This exchange created a space where there was no judgment, but truth. Not the truth that oppresses, but the truth that liberates. And it was in this environment that I realized my scars no longer needed to be hidden. They were maps that could help others escape similar labyrinths. What once shamed me now had purpose. Vulnerability became a bridge, and each encounter, each shared story, became a living reminder that even when everything seems to be falling apart, there is still the possibility of rebuilding. There is still love, there is still faith, but a faith that embraces, not oppresses. A faith that sustains, not crushes. And it was at that point that I understood that my journey was no longer just about me. At 55, with wrinkles marked not only by time, but by the intensity of everything I've experienced, I started from scratch, or perhaps from an even deeper place than that. It wasn't pretty at first. It was slow, it was tiring, it was scary. Many people imagine that starting over at this stage of life is nearly impossible. And indeed, sometimes it seems so. You look around and find yourself surrounded by younger, more agile, more confident people, while you carry not only your age, but a lifetime of pain, frustrations, and memories that still bleed inside. But there's something maturity brings. The awareness that if you've survived what broke you, you're also capable of building something new with your own hands, even if they tremble. It was in this spirit of reconstruction that I decided to return to school, without glamour, without the expectation of applause, just with a thirst to reframe my own story. I enrolled in a counseling course, seeking tools that could help me better understand what I had experienced, and most importantly, how to transform it all into something that could have a real impact on the lives of other women. It wasn't just about learning theories. It was about seeing myself as someone still capable of serving, of transforming environments, of being a bridge where before I had only known the abyss. At the same time, I joined a support group that was like fertile ground for a soul that had forgotten what it meant to flourish. Those meetings, simple, unpretentious, often filled with tears, were fundamental to my emotional reconstruction. There, I was able to bear myself without fear, without masks, without performance, and also to hear, with humility, the echo of my pain repeated in the voices of so many others. It was as if we were all relearning to breathe, together, and that gave me strength. More than that, it gave me clarity. Spirituality, which had previously become a prison of rules and judgments, now took on a new form. It was no longer about being perfect for God, but about allowing myself to be imperfect before Him, and yet deeply loved. This was perhaps the greatest shift in mindset I've ever experienced. Understanding that faith isn't a performance, it's a surrender. that God never asked me to silently endure what was destroying me. That was a human expectation, not divine. And then, almost without realizing it, other women began to seek me out. Some came silently, with downcast eyes, as if carrying too much guilt to speak aloud. Others came angry, with sharp words and broken hearts. But all came thirsty, and I began to share with them not only what I'd learned from books, but what I'd learned through bleeding. With each conversation, each session, each silent embrace, I understood more deeply the true meaning of the word reconstruction. Today, I can say I'm whole, not because everything went back to the way it was, but because I've become a different me, a more lucid, freer version, more aware of who I am and what I carry. Professionally, I've found a purpose that isn't based on status, but on impact. In helping other women cross the rubble that once covered me, in showing that there's no right age to start over, but rather, there is a powerful decision that changes everything. To no longer accept living in the role you were given, but to write your own story. And that story, even though it began with pain, today walks with a kind of strength that only comes from those who have gone through the valley and haven't lost the ability to love. If I could sit with every woman going through this right now, face to face, in a safe corner of silence, I would first say what I've needed to hear for so long, but no one had the courage to tell me, "You're not crazy." This confusion you feel, this emptiness mixed with anger, fear, guilt, it all makes sense. It's all part of a pain that can't be resolved with ready-made phrases or quick advice, and most importantly, it can't be resolved alone. But that doesn't make you weak. Quite the opposite. Do you know what's weak? Pretending everything is okay while you're bleeding inside. What you're doing, admitting the pain, questioning, searching for air amidst the rubble, that's raw strength. Maybe still disorganized, maybe still shaky, but it's already the beginning of transformation. And I know you were probably taught to keep quiet, to suppress yourself to maintain the peace, to blame yourself for not being able to forgive quickly, for not being able to smile easily, for not being able to pray like you used to. But let me tell you a truth that freed me when I needed it most. There are crosses God never placed on your shoulders. It was others. It was culture. It was misinterpreted religion. It was expectations built upon you as if you existed only to endure, only to support what is falling without ever falling with it. But the truth is, God never called you to a burden that destroys you. He called you to life. And life, truly, begins when you come back to yourself. Coming back to yourself is that courageous act of looking at yourself with kindness and saying, "I deserve more than survival." It's breaking free from the guilt you inherited as if loving yourself were selfish. It's understanding that your identity isn't in what was done to you, but in who you are when no one judges you, when you breathe in peace. There are women listening to this right now who are so hurt they can't even cry anymore. And I understand, because I too became stone inside for a while, dry, cold, silent. But stone isn't identity. It's just protection. And one day, when you allow yourself to feel without shame, without fear, the flow of life returns. It's like unlocking a dam. It's confusing, it's powerful, it's liberating, but it's real. And it's in this reality that healing resides. You know, no one told you the inside story of this pain. No one prepared you for the impact of seeing faith mixed with abuse, love confused with control, hope crushed by broken promises. But now you know, and knowing hurts, but it also awakens you. Because the hidden truth behind all this is that you never needed to be perfect to be loved. Not by God, not by anyone. So if you're there, silent, afraid of going crazy, thinking you've lost everything, know this: you haven't lost you. And that's what matters. Come back to yourself. Breathe again. Rewrite your story with the ink of truth and the paper of courage. What they did to you doesn't define who you are, but what you choose to do now, that has the power to change everything. And this decision, however small, however lonely, however full of doubts, this decision is the beginning of a path that can lead you back to the freedom that should never have been taken from you. And it was during this entire process, amidst ruins and reconstructions, that I began to see God in a completely different way. Not that distant, impassive God who observes everything from above with a clipboard in hand and an expression that said, "You deserve to go through this." No, the God I knew after the pain was the God who knelt with me on the floor of my soul, amidst the shame, the tears hidden in the pillow, the confusion between faith and despair. He was the God who didn't condone what they did to me, but who, even so, remained there, silent at times, but never absent. Many people associate God with the idea of absolute control, as if everything, absolutely everything, were part of a divine plan. But this is a dangerous distortion, because it makes it seem as if even the betrayal, the emotional violence, the silencing we suffer, is part of something permitted by Him. This is not true. God is not complicit in injustice. He did not slumber while you were hurt. He did not bless abuse disguised as spiritual care. The hidden truth that few have the courage to say is that evil also operates, and operates even within places that bear His name. But God remains just, and more than that, He is the first to stand up when a woman is silenced. For a long time, I thought God's silence was indifference. But gradually, I began to realize it was preparation, that something was being created there in the darkness, in the secret, while I felt invisible. The framework of faith is built where human eyes cannot see. God was teaching me to hear His voice within, not in the rules, not in the performance, not in the prepared speeches, but in my conscience being restored, in my dignity blossoming again after years of being stifled. And it was in this inner realm that I began to understand that spirituality is not a prison of conduct, but a path to freedom. This mindset freed me. God wasn't trying to domesticate me, reduce me, or mold me into a submissive and silent woman. On the contrary, He was teaching me to stand up, to speak out, to transform what hurt into strength. He was reviving the essence I had forgotten. And when this began to happen, everything took on a new dimension. Even the pain took on a purpose. Not because it was good, but because it was no longer the end of the story. It was just a turning point. Seeing God like that, amidst the broken pieces, was the greatest revelation of my life. And ironically, it was far from institutional religion that I came to know Him best. Because there, in the depths of my soul, without an audience, without manipulated guilt, without theater, He reminded me that being a woman was never a mistake. That feeling is not weakness. That breaking with what destroys is not rebellion. It is wisdom. He didn't expect me to be silent. He expected me to blossom even after winter. And that's when everything began to make sense in a new way. What was once just survival became a journey. What was once just scars became testimony. And what was once loneliness became movement. Because when a woman rises after being silent, she doesn't rise alone. She carries with her the strength of many others who are still trying to find their way out of the labyrinth. Today, when I look back with the maturity of someone who has navigated internal deserts and external storms, I see everything differently. Yes, I was betrayed. Yes, I was silenced. And yes, for a time, I believed this would define my destiny. But today, with a clear mind and a restored heart, I know I was not destroyed. Because there is a strength that is born when everything around us crumbles, and yet we choose to remain standing. It's not about empty resilience or catchphrases that try to whitewash the chaos. It's about facing your own truth, without filter, without fear, and without any more shame of being who you are. God took me from the shadow of an altar built on control, appearance, and manipulation. A false altar where holiness was measured by silence and devotion was confused with blind submission. There I was erased. There I was told that suffering in silence was proof of faith, that denying my pain was a sign of mature spirituality, that questioning was rebellion. And for a time, I swallowed it all, until I almost disappeared within myself. But God, the real God, The God of life and truth didn't leave me there. He sought me out. He took me by the arm with firmness and mercy, and he led me to a place I never imagined could exist, the altar of truth. And when I say altar of truth, I'm not talking about a physical place, nor an institution. I'm talking about an inner realm, a place where faith requires no disguise, where prayer has no script, where the woman you are with all your history, your falls, your muffled cries, and your new beginnings is received whole, without editing. It was on this altar that I rediscovered God, not the God who demanded perfection from me, but the one who offered me freedom, not the one who demanded performance, but the one who embraced humanity. And that changed everything, because there I understood that I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not worthiness, not forgiveness, not strength. What once made me hide now made me blossom. Every tear I was taught to hide turned into a river that cleansed me from within. Every fear that paralyzed me became a sign that I was still alive. And every time I had to stand up alone, without applause, without witnesses, was a practical lesson in courage. I became a woman, finally. Not the idealized one, shaped by the gaze of others, but the real one. With scars I'm no longer ashamed to show, because they tell a story worth telling. And this story doesn't end in pain. It goes through it, yes, and acknowledges the profound impact it had. But it doesn't stop there. The pain tore me apart, but it also opened me. And it is in this open space, where before there was only silence and guilt, that new choices now reside. Conscious, free choices, aligned with what truly matters. I learned to stop asking for permission to exist, to stop shrinking to fit into spaces too small for me. And most importantly, I learned to listen to that inner voice that, for years, was muffled by prepackaged speeches. A voice that says, "You have value even when no one recognizes it. You have a calling, even if they've tried to silence you. You have a mission, even if they try to convince you it's too late." Nothing is too late when God decides to rebuild something with his own hands, because he doesn't improvise. He restores with purpose, and every piece that seemed lost, he fits together in a surprising way. The time of reconstruction may seem slow, but it carries profound revelations. It is there, in the silence of the journey, that we rediscover who we truly are, without labels, without imposed burdens, without the fear of disappointing others' expectations. It is a reunion with ourselves, and with a God who doesn't impose guilt, but offers direction. And when this awareness awakens, something changes forever.